of Humanities, Kim Hicks, who have provided the grant funding and the logistics for this event. Also, at the end of the presentation, copies of Mr. Miller's books will be available for purchase at a discount and for author signing. And now I'm going to pull out my reading glasses, which actually I really do need for this. We're lucky indeed to have Mr. Miller join us on the day after President's Day to speak about presidential cookery. In addition to being one of America's newest food writing stars, Mr. Miller, who lives in Denver, is also a certified barbecue judge and the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches. When not running an organization and judging tasty things, lucky for us, he writes amazing books about American food. His new book traces the intersection of African American and presidential foodways. His 2013 book, Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, won a James Beard Award, the most prestigious food writing award in the United States. Adrian Miller is here with us today because of a research writing student I had this fall at HCC, who asked me for sources on Afro-Caribbean foodways for his research paper on soul food. Luckily, that very weekend, I was out west for my college reunion at Stanford. Who should I meet in the beverage line but the famous food writer, Adrian Miller? In a class of 1,500 students, there were always new friends to meet, and Mr. Miller had a great suggestion for sources to help my student. I always tell my students that learning how to research and write is an act of generosity, because the readers in your community benefit from learning something new. Certainly, this is most true of Adrian Miller, who tells fascinating stories about American cuisine at the scale of the office of the president and at the scale of the African Americans cooking the food. These cooks, sometimes enslaved, fed the affairs of state. The stories Mr. Miller shares with us are about our common American history and the uneven progress of our democracy. His writing is elegant and his stories are delicious. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Miller.
I'm going to give you a big hug because you did a lot to make this happen. So thank you all for being here tonight. So I'm a very casual speaker, so if you have a question as I go through this, please just raise your hand. But what I'm going to do tonight is tell you about my journey, how I came to write this book, and then I'm just going to go through some of the best stories, well, not all of the best stories, some of them in my book, and just give you a feel for how I tackle this subject. But I also want to thank our sponsors, and I'm on the board of Colorado Humanities, so I understand. Just thank you for the support to do this. So, you all heard that I'm from Denver, Colorado, which immediately loses me street cred on the subject of soul food. So this is how I win people back. I tell them my parents are from the South. My mom is from Chattanooga, Tennessee. My dad's from Helena, Arkansas. So this is the food that I grew up eating. And so just to give you my bio, born and raised in Denver, moved out to one of its suburbs, then went to Stanford undergrad, where Sarah and I also shared the alma mater. And then I went to Georgetown Law School. So I practiced law in Denver for about 4 years. And this is not to disparage anybody who knows attorneys, but it wasn't for me. It got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office, so I figured I needed to do something else. Thanks for laughing at that joke. I worked hard on that one. I figured I needed to do something else, so I was going to open up a soul food restaurant in Denver, but then a law school classmate from Georgetown calls me up in my office in Denver and just asked me if I knew anybody back in D.C. who might be interested in working in the White House. This is the time President Clinton was president. And I said, well, tell me about the job. And it was called the Initiative for One America. It was an outgrowth on Clinton's initiative on race. And here's the crazy idea that underpinned that effort. If we just talk to one another and listen to each other, we might realize we have a lot more in common than what divides us. That's the crazy idea. So the Initiative on Race, we could use that now, couldn't we? So the Initiative on Race lasted for about a year and a half, and then the Initiative on One America continued that work as a standing office in the White House. So when she presented this to me, I did the same thing that Dick Cheney did when George W. Bush asked him to find a vice president. I was the head of the search committee, only my name was on the list. So I got the job, went to DC and loved it. Loved my time in the White House. The only thing that really kind of irked me a little bit, because I love my president, but you've heard stories of President Clinton, how he meets people and he makes them feel like they're the only person in the room, draws them in. I never got that. Every time I met him, it was like the first time I'd say, Mr. President, he'd just give me a blank look, kind of like the one you're giving me right now. I'm Adrian Miller, still blank look. I work on your One American, and she's like, oh, that's great. So anyway, but it was a lot of fun, and I was at the very end of his second term, and what happens at the change of an administration is all of the appointees have to write out their letters of resignation, and then it's up to the incoming president to decide whether to accept it or not. Shockingly, George W. Bush accepted my resignation, so I was jobless. And the job market was pretty slow at that time, and at that time, my ambition was to become the senator from Colorado. So I actually sought out some wise heads in D.C. and just asked them, you know, I'm thinking about going back to Colorado to run for office, but I really like D.C. And they just looked me point blank and said, you're just way too nice, man. You're not going to get to the highest point in D.C. You'll be a mid-level player at best. You should just go back to Colorado. I was like, all right, that makes sense. But the job market was slow, so it was hard to get a job at that point. And I have to admit, I got to the point where I was watching a lot of daytime television, and I said, I guess I should read something. So I went to the bookstore, and I got a book on the history of Southern food written by a guy named John Edgerton. And that book is Southern Food, at Home, on the Road, in History. And in that book, he said that a tribute to African-American achievement in cookery has yet to be written. I thought that was interesting. The book was about 10 years old, and so I just wrote to him and asked him if somebody had taken on that work in the interim, because I was convinced that somebody had done it. And he said, well, you know, nobody's really taken on the full project. They've done pieces of it, but nobody's done the full story. So with no qualifications at all, except for eating soul food a lot, thank you, and cooking soul food some, I decided to dive in. And that led to me writing my first book on the history of soul food. And the way I wrote that book is I created a representative soul food meal, and I wrote a chapter about each part of that meal. And I explained what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, what it means for the culture. So how many of you are familiar with soul food? You've had it? Okay. All right. Now, you all have been very nice to me, so I'm inviting you to heckle me, okay? I want to lay out the meal. Entrees: fried chicken, catfish, or chitlins. Y'all know what chitlins are? Okay. Pig intestines. Are you okay?
Oh, yeah.
All right. A little disgusting right there. All right. Side dishes: greens, black-eyed peas, mac and cheese, candy jams. Then I wrote a chapter about cornbread. I also wrote a chapter about hot sauce, because in soul food culture we put hot sauce on everything. And then I wrote a chapter about red drink, because I believe red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink. Now you have to understand, in soul food culture, red is a color and a flavor. We don't call things tropical punch, has hints of cranberry, it's just red, okay? Now there is a generational shift happening where a lot of youngins seem to like purple and blue, all right? And as I write in my book, I do believe that children are our future, that we should teach them well and let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid, they're messing it up. Then on dessert, I couldn't settle on one, so I wrote about 4. Peach cobbler, pound cake, banana pudding, sweet potato pie. So that's the meal, what do you think? Decent? All right.
I want it.
So to research that book, I read about 3,000 interviews of formerly enslaved people and indexed them for food references. Read about 500 cookbooks and innumerable newspaper articles, because there were companies that were digitizing old historic newspapers and they were word searchable. So that's where a lot of my research went. And the most fun part of that research was I actually ate my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities and 15 states. If you look surprised that I'm still alive. If you were my Facebook friend, I actually took you along for the journey. So I would take a picture of the exterior of the building and then the plate of food that I was eating. And it was really while researching this, especially in the historic newspapers, that these African Americans who cooked for our presidents jumped off the page. And once I started to collect those stories, I said, after I do this soul food book, this is the story I want to tell. And I'm kicking myself because I could have gotten so much scoop if I had just thought about this while I was in the White House. But of course, I got the idea afterwards. The other thing I'm kicking myself about is, you remember when that couple snuck into the White House? Do you remember that? To the state dinner? I was like, I didn't know it was so easy. I would have tried that. So that led to the President's Kitchen Cabinet. And the way that I have written this book, because through my research, I identified about 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents from day one, all the way from Washington, including Trump, because there are holdovers from the Obama kitchen who are currently working for Trump until he decides what he wants to do with his kitchen. And not all of them have been the head cook, but they've either been on staff in the presidential kitchen, or they cooked for the president when the president traveled, either by train
yacht. Yes, we used to have a presidential yacht until Jimmy Carter, on Air Force One. And then also when the president would go travel someplace and chill for a while, there usually was an African-American cooking for the president. So I organized the book by types of cooks. So I start out with just an overview of presidential foodways and the ingredients involved. So if any of you have cooking experience or culinary school experience, they often teach you to create a mise en place. So that means set out all your separate ingredients and just make sure you have everything you need to start the meal. So what I do is I just talk about all the elements of presidential foodways, and then we go into different types of cooks. So I start out with the stewards, and the steward was really the person that was in charge of all the domestic operations. So they were in charge of hiring staff, and they actually did the grocery shopping, and sometimes they would do cooking and devise the menus. That has changed over time. So it was steward for about 120 years in presidential history, and then the maitre d', so the head butler, kind of got that role, or the head housekeeper, depending on the administration. And then in the 1950s, there's this position called chief usher that was created. And when chief usher gets created, that's essentially the role of the steward. And since then, the chief usher is the person who runs all the operations in the White House. So we start there, then we talk about enslaved cooks, because we've had a lot of slave-holding presidents. And then we talk about the free cooks, particularly after emancipation. And then I talk about what happens when the president travels. And then I do a chapter especially on drinks, because a lot of African Americans have been in charge of either making drinks or supervising the wine cellar or being the sommelier at the White House. And then I end by talking the future of African American presidential chefs. All right? So let's just go through the stories now. And this is a Kool-Aid pickle. Has anybody here ever had a Kool-Aid pickle? All right. It's red. Yes, it is. You're good, good. Here's how you make a Kool-Aid pickle. You get a jar of already made pickles, open it, take the pickles out, make Kool-Aid with the pickle brine, all that pickle juice, you make Kool-Aid. So you just substitute water for the pickle, okay? And then you either cut the pickles or poke holes in them, put it back in the jar, close it, leave it there for 2 weeks, take it out and eat it. If you like the taste of pickles and a Kool-Aid, it's just a sweet and sour combination. If you don't like either one of those, it's one of the nastiest things you'll ever put in your mouth. Okay? I think it is the perfect metaphor for how we think of the presidency, right? Kind of fascinating, sometimes weird, sometimes disgusting, sweet and sour. And that is the presidential pickle, as I call it, because we put our presidents in a box. We want them to be extraordinary people, but we also want them to be a lot like us. And food can be a metaphor for the presidential character. So if we have a president that loves fancy food or foreign food a lot, we kind of think, well, that president's kind of snooty. But if they like down-home food or the food of their childhood, we're like, okay, that person has the common touch. So a lot of times, presidents will control their image by making sure that you know that they like the foods of their childhood or regional American food. This is a picture, this is the earliest known picture of the domestic staff at the White House. This was taken in the spring of 1877. Does anybody here know who was president spring of 1877? Oh, your high school history teachers would be so disappointed.
Harrison?
Close. No, you had the right letter.
Oh. Another H one.
Another H one. What? Yeah, letters H. Rutherford B. Hayes.
Hayes.
Oh, it was on the tip of your tongue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So, so here are the staff. So we have basically the butlers, the maids, and the cooks. And this woman here is a woman named Winnie Monroe, who was the private cook for the Hayeses and comes with them to the White House. Most of our African-American cooks in White House history are accidental cooks. They happen to be either enslaved by a president or they were the president's longtime family cook. And the reason why a lot of presidents would bring their family cook or enslaved person with them, and a lot of people don't know this, before President Truman, presidents paid for the staff and the food and entertaining out of their own pocket.
Oh.
So if you brought an enslaved cook or your personal cook, you could pay them under market wages, right? You didn't have to, so you saved money. All right, Samuel Francis. Now I know what you're thinking. That dude looks a lot like a white dude. Okay, yes. Yeah. So there's a lot of argument about this guy's ancestral history, but he is a biracial man from Haiti who arrives in New York in about the 1750s and runs a number of businesses, but then he creates a tavern called Francis Tavern. If you go to New York City, there's a replica of that tavern to this day. on 54 Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan, so not too far from Wall Street. So he runs this tavern, and General Washington digs his food.